Right, so the question of the talk, the question of the day is my husband trying to kill me? A relevant question. Killer Cake and Reckless Romance in Dragonwyck. Now, you might be able to tell from the title, Killer Cake, that the answer is probably yes, but if the title didn't give it away, I'm presuming that this picture of Vincent Price looking incredibly shady in the background would give away the answer anyway. Dragonwyck, if you're not aware, is a 1946 film starring Vincent Price and Jean Tierney and directed by Joseph Mankiewicz. And it's based on the novel published a year previously of Dragonwyck by Anya Seton. Now, I'm going to be thinking about the film specifically today as a discrete text and not really talking that much about the novel. I'm going to be looking at what the film does. And particularly, we're going to be looking at the way in which it stands at the intersection of a number of genres. And we're going to be using those genres to interrogate the film and see what it's doing and trying to draw out some of its complexities. So we're going to start by thinking of Dragonwyck as a Gothic romance. We're thinking here of the Gothic romance as a sort of transmedia phenomenon appearing in literature, film, and in other media as well. We'll then be moving on to think about Dragonwyck specifically as a film, and specifically as a film created in the 1940s, putting it broadly within the category of the paranoid women's film, although we're going to be talking about the generic instability of the film and also the other words of categorizing it that exist. Finally, we're going to be moving out of this concentration on the film as a romance or as a woman's film and thinking about Dragonwyck as it relates to the wider New England Gothic and seeing what other sort of subtext that draws out for us. So, what is a Gothic romance? Before we can talk about Dragonwyck and a Gothic romance, we have to know what the Gothic romance is. One of the most common ways of defining it is in relation to the Gothic romance as a publishing genre, i.e. a subgenre of the wider popular romance. The most common way of defining it is often by offering a fairly prescriptive list of characteristics that it includes. The most famous and complete of these is Joanna Russ's list from Somebody's Trying to Kill Me, and I Think It's My Husband. She argues that we need one inexperienced and innocent heroine who is starting a new life in a large, lonely, brooding house or similar in exotic or isolated country. We usually have an absent or deceased mother or father figure, although the mother is also sometimes wicked. There will be a hero or anti-hero or perhaps villain, who can say, who's dark, magnetic, powerful, brooding, and sardonic. There'll also usually be another woman who's a double or a rival, and there'll be a buried ominous secret or 3 or 4 or 5 that need to be uncovered. There's often a young girl for our heroine to look after, and quite possibly a shadow male, and we'll go back later to the idea of what a shadow male is. There'll also be some ominous dialogue and the inevitable untangling at the end of the novel and or film. However, these formulas tend to be a little bit prescriptive. The more recent work of Laurie A. Page has looked at the Gothic romance and sort of broadened this definition out somewhat. Laurie A. Page notes that the sort of text on which many of the Gothic romances are based is Jane Eyre. And she points towards a number of fairly standard elements, ones that are mostly familiar to us from Russ: the naive ingenue, a forbidding atmosphere, a gloomy, crumbling manor house or castle, a charismatic, aristocratic hero, and also the broader idea of this story of a disenfranchised heroine escaping domestic peril while she's staking her claim to the house and or its master. But one thing that Laurie A. Page notes is that although these are fairly standard features, and the Gothic does share some staple elements, there is considerable variation among the many titles and clear distinctions between subgenres within it. She argues that what we need for the Gothic romance, in a sort of broader sense, moving away from this list of elements or tropes, is a heroine's perspective. So during the reading of a Gothic romance, she argues, the reader will inhabit the body of the heroine for the duration of the book. The story will be hers to tell. Her ultimate triumph is that of the reader, who cheers her on for defeating the villain and claiming the love she deserves. She argues that there are 4 basic heroines that we might encounter. The first is somebody encountering a new job as a governess, companion, or housekeeper. The second is as a frightened or inexperienced new bride. The third is a modern employee, with perhaps more overtones of feminist liberation, or as a female heir or new owner. And the hero may represent the danger that the text presents to the female character, or he might present comfort and support. Now, we should take even this broader sort of understanding a little bit with a pinch of salt. These sort of descriptions of the Gothics often offer fairly good descriptions of widespread or common characteristics, but they also get to be prescriptive in ways that aren't very helpful. For example, there are a number of Gothic romance novels which are from a male perspective. There are occasionally other forms of heroine, and the heroes don't fit simply into two easy molds. As I have noted in my published work, these formulas or ideas of formulas portray the Gothic romance as an endless number of iterations of one Gothic story, with a superficial appropriation of Gothic tropes and aesthetics. And they leave us confined within an existing feminist critical discourse regarding Gothics, which view them as depicting the exploration of the meaning of the patriarchy for women, with all its assorted terrors. Now, of course, such a reading is helpful as an entry point into these texts and may reveal a lot about them. It's not inapposite, but it does diminish the possibility that these books, individually and collectively, explore more than a fairly limited conception of women's experience as simply a struggle against patriarchal control within the context of heterosexual relationships. So what I'm going to do, particularly in the last part of the talk on the New England Gothic, is think about how a text like Dragonwyck can move us outside of that conception as well. So with that brief introduction to the Gothic romance, we need to answer the question of whether this film is a Gothic romance at all. Is that a useful title to give it, and what might it tell us? Now, I'm going to go back to the Russ here. We've seen the problems with it, that it's overly prescriptive, but it does offer a number of key features which we're finding in these texts. Now, Russ was writing about the 1960s and the start of the sort of literary subgenre, the textual subgenre of the Gothic romance, and our text is from the 1940s. However, the 1960s saw the rise of the Gothic romance after the publication of Victoria Holt's Mistress of Mellon, but it does have a prehistory of which Dragonwyck is part. And by looking at these earlier texts, it can also help us to move out of that more limited definition. Anyway, which of these elements do we find in the film? Well, first of all, we have Jean Tierney as an inexperienced and innocent heroine. She's of a lower social status than the male protagonist, who is the American equivalent of an aristocrat, as we'll talk about in a second, and she's young and entering a new situation. Officially, she's some sort of distant relative, but she is hired to look after Nicholas's daughter. Now, I'm going to be pointing out a couple of little technical bits around the film, showing how the framing, etc., highlights these aspects of the Gothic romance in the film. And you'll notice from the way in which Jean Tierney is shot that she's often, if not always, looking upwards at the hero throughout the first and much of the second half of the film. It emphasizes this power dynamic that we're talking about, and these comparative statuses, and also that sort of air of wonder that she's continually caught with highlights the idea of inexperience and innocence. We also have the large, lonely and brooding house in exotic or isolated country, as you can see here, the giant house of Dragonwyck, which is along the Hudson River, in this kind of mock medieval Gothic style house that we do find in the Hudson Valley. Another little bit of camera trickery here is quite interesting, that the first sight of the house is through a telescope. And obviously, you can imagine 1940s cinema trickery, that's a little model. But Peterson has noted something interesting about this introductory perspective, that we first encounter Dragonwyck in a point of view shot that emphasizes that initial distance between Jean Tierney's middle-class protagonist and the object of her bourgeois desire, the landed gentry estate and its owner. Another little bit of cinema trickery that we find in the depiction of the house is the use of matte shots. So as Peterson notes, Dragonwyck uses painted mats, as you can just about see if you look at these pictures closely enough, to create both the outside perspective of the house, but also the cavernous aristocratic spaces that dwarf their protagonists. Peterson notes that in both Rebecca, in the Hall of Manderley, and in Dragonwyck, they produce a fantastic film version of the Gothic trope of live burial and claustration. So more than simply tropes, what we're finding here is a number of sort of thematic and aesthetic elements being drawn out in these seemingly stereotypical settings. Now, our next requirement is a dark, magnetic, powerful, brooding, and sardonic supermale. So our heroine is Miranda, and our hero here is Nicholas van Ryn, who is a patroon, one of the old Dutch landlords along the Hudson Valley. He owns Dragonwyck and a couple of 100 acres of land, which is farmed by tenant farmers. The first shot in which he's introduced is the shot that we see on the left, and he enters the room at the hotel in New York where he's meeting Miranda and her father for the first time through this sort of curtained recess, reminiscent of the theatre, almost as though he's entering into a performance of some kind. And we do find later on that his personality and his appearance is a sort of performance, covering over elements of insanity and violence. So if you're watching the film with a knowing eye, you can see a lot of hints about who he is coming through. And it's sort of a little puzzle for you to work out. In the second picture, we see him sitting in the chair of the patroon from which he collects the rents from his tenant farmers. And it's very emblematic of both his station and how he views himself as this sort of quasi-aristocratic figure. Now, the other woman appears in interesting ways in Dragonwyck, and there are two other women. Now, remember that Russ pointed out that they might be doubles or rivals, and the first woman on the left is Joanna, who's actually Nicholas's wife. So when Miranda meets him, he is married to this woman, and she can be seen, therefore, perhaps as a potential rival, because Miranda fairly quickly falls in love with Nicholas. In the other picture, we have Nicholas playing the piano for Miranda, being looked over by a portrait of his ancestor, Azilda, and there is a rumour or a superstition in the house that when disaster falls or is about to fall, we will hear her singing. It's part of a curse on the house that either she caused or that she reflects because of her own tragic history. Married against her will to a man she didn't love and who didn't love her, she was only valued for her ability to have a child and was eventually driven to suicide by the treatment that she received. Now, in many ways, she is a double of Miranda. As Baxter notes, the heroines in such films and books as Manderley and Dragonwyck, who appear, who have these portraits of other women in the house, the heroines need to interpret the returned gaze of the woman in the portrait in order to see that she represents what they may become if incautious, victims of male violence. There are plenty of warning signs and fairly obvious red flags for Miranda in the house, and this painting is one of them. In it, she sees what will essentially be her future. After she herself marries Nicholas, after she has a child and that child dies, he also wishes to discard her, having only valued her in many ways for her ability to have a child. And so her future is foretold by this painting, but she ignores the signs, which actually brings us back to Nicholas's first wife. Because she ignores the signs there, in seeing her as a rival, she fails to notice that she's also a double. Now, you might notice this plant here quite obtrusively placed. The film is oleander, and that is what Nicholas uses to poison and kill his first wife to get her out of the way. At the end of the film, don't worry, it ends happily, but towards the end of the film, Miranda also has the oleander plant moved into her room, a warning that death is very nigh. We also have a young girl, Katrine, the girl that she is here to care for, and who is the daughter of Nicholas and Joanna, and is sort of very frilly. Theoretically, Gene Tierney is looking after her, but spends most of the film nowhere near her. We also have the ominous secret, or secrets. The first one I've already hinted at is the fact that Nicholas murdered his first wife. The second is a secret about Nicholas himself, and it involves the tower room in which he hides frequently. In the shot on the right there, we see this fantastic sort of framing of Gene Tierney going up to that attic, using that shadow of the staircase, very reminiscent of Nosferatu, as she journeys up to this other space. And I really love this shot because that sort of distorted and twisted shadow of the staircase leads us up into the distorted and fractured world of Nicholas, who has become, this is the big secret of the film, he has become a drug addict, and is increasingly losing his own hold on reality. So I wanted to take a second, because of the theme of the day, to think about food in Dragonwyck, because food is also really central to one of these buried secrets. The murder weapon that Nicholas uses against his wife is, yes, the white oleander that he uses to poison her, but very specifically, he puts it in a cake. That's where the killer cake comes in, a rum-soaked cake. But food more generally in the text is used to donate a number of different things, including the psychology and personal aspirations of various characters, markers of class, and also the relationships between characters. So in the picture on the left, we see the first meeting before the first meeting of Miranda and Nicholas. She has been invited to New York with her father, and we see here the first meal that they have in New York. Nicholas has ordered it for them, but he hasn't arrived yet. Miranda is delighted. There's all of these new and delicate foods, including fruit soaked in alcohol, of which her father most certainly doesn't approve. They have very different reactions to the table. Miranda is delighted, and it gives us an idea and lets us into sort of her own wishes and aspirations and her own longing for this aristocratic life. And for this indulgence as well, this exploration. Her father is routinely disapproving of all of it, and represents a sort of different set of values, which will ultimately, in some ways, triumph by the end of the film, and we'll come back to that later. Another thing that's kind of highlighted here is issues of class, as neither of them know how to eat the food or know what it is, and food becomes a marker of class throughout. In the second picture, we see the first dinner that Miranda has at Dragonwyck House after she's been brought there from New York, and this is the first time that she meets Joanna. You can probably see in the placement of the scene that this scene does interesting things with the relationships between the characters. When Nicholas arrives back, we are introduced to the character of his wife entirely circulating around food. We're told that what she views as the highest value is punctuality at meals, and he spends much of his conversation talking with her about the pastries that he has brought her from New York, about which she anxiously inquires a number of times. She is characterized by her relationship to food, as is Miranda in a number of ways, or she abstemiously eats a very thin soup. The wife, Joanna, tucks away a variety of different dishes. We can also see something about Nicholas's relationship to both of them in the way he addresses their relationship with food and the way they and food interact. So with his wife, he is polite but cold in his discussion of the pastries, seemingly indulgent but also very clearly disdainful. With Miranda, he is courteous and solicitous of her hungers and her needs, making sure that she is well cared for. I will just note, by the way, in case you're interested in Dragonwyck, that the film itself is mildly fatphobic, but the book is horrendously so. After she's killed with cake, for example, Nicholas, on seeing her dad, says, "Well, her vile gluttony has killed her at last." And the doctor, instead of going, "Wait, that's probably quite suspicious, actually," says, "Yes." And it takes him a couple of years to realise that that probably wasn't the most normal thing to say when your wife has died. So the food is really central to the novel, but it also remains fairly central to the film in a number of ways. So after our food detour, let's get back to this list of Gothic romance elements. We have the untangling finally, and I think this is quite a funny juxtaposition of issues. If you had to imagine what the story was here and what the untangling was, I wonder what it would be. All I can think of is not quite what it is, but what we find out at the end of the film is that Azilde is real. The curse is real. Her singing is real, essentially. She's foretold both the fall of the House of Dragonwyck and Miranda's own fate. We have the secrets of Nicholas revealed, and he is sort of fought off by the local doctor, Jeff. And as this sort of positioning might suggest, there is a love triangle going on, although you might be forgiven for thinking from that picture that the two interested parties are the two men. Instead, Jeff offers is the shadow male of the piece. He offers sort of another male figure who will later come to protect and marry Miranda. So that love triangle is finally resolved in the denouement as well. So I mentioned that Jeff is a shadow male. So in the shadow male of Russ, quite frequently, the shadow male is seen as being somebody who seems to be nice and supportive, but is revealed to be the real villain of the piece. And the poor misunderstood aristocrat who's always really mean is revealed to be actually the hero who loved her the whole time. Not my favorite trope. But something that's particularly interesting about this time period is that this, in these films from the 1940s, and from these kind of earlier examples of Gothic romance, there's a slightly different trope going on. So Baxter notes that in the pulp paperbacks of the 60s and 70s, it's usually he, the shadow male, rather than the brooding central male who turns out to be the actual villain. But in the wartime Gothic films, the other man is the one who helps the heroine her investigation. This man's symbolic purpose is to reassure viewers that it is the hero villain who is individually at fault, rather than the whole institution of marriage, since he's here to form a heterosexual couple with the heroine at the narrative's conclusion. So we don't have to worry that heterosexuality or patriarchy is the problem. We just have to worry about aristocracy and/or insanity and/or drug use. We'll go back to this later, that Nicholas doesn't simply represent the individual, he also becomes a representative of a particular system. But this is a good distinction to make, a really interesting kind of aspect of this particular era of the Gothic romance. Now, we've already started to think about this as a film specifically, and questions around the genre that we would apply to this as a film are, well, there's lots of different views from lots of different critics. We've been talking about it as a Gothic romance. Also, in terms of when it was made, 1946, it's a women's wartime or just after wartime film. But lots of other generic labels have been added to it that can make us think about the film in different ways. Alison McKee suggests that it's a melodrama, and she sees the melodrama as an anti-realist form of expression. It's unreal, but concerned with real history and historical conditions writ large and through anti-realist conventions. So it takes all of these aspects of excess, over-the-top actions, characters, and settings to reveal some sort of truths about the period or about things like gender or class relations. And we'll go back to what those might be in a moment. Mark Yankovic suggests that it's a women's horror and says that it was understood contemporarily as a woman's horror film, or as one of the women's horror films. He says that we don't often think of these films as horror today because of the sort of canonization of horror and the critical traditions around horror. That accounts of the horror films since the 1960s have tended to privilege alternative traditions of horror, so that these films are generally excluded from most histories of the genre's development. The last category is the paranoid women's film, as we see it labelled in Marianne Dearns in The Desire to Desire, the women's film of the 1940s. So what are these films doing? What are they interested in doing beyond exploring, as the Gothic romance does, the possibilities of romance and the threats potentially facing the heroine in her decision about who to love? Well, Mark Yankovic notes that they offer horror from a woman's perspective. So although these films are quite diverse, they mostly involve a woman who feels threatened or tortured by a seemingly sadistic male authority figure, who's usually her husband, a feature that prompted critics at the time to identify them explicitly as retellings of the fairy tale of Bluebeard. So films like Rebecca, like Dragonwyck, and like Gaslight, those are the kind of films we're talking about here, which view a particularly female form of horror, but also are reflecting particular issues of the 1940s. One of the key motifs, as Diane Walden points out, is the woman in the house motif that might be related to the particular political moment and the bourgeois separation between productive and reproductive realms, with its restriction of women to the domestic sphere. So during the Second World War, of course, we had seen a number of sort of opportunities, for want of a better word, opening up for women outside of the house. With the end of the Second World War, these closed off to some extent, and we're seeing this negotiation of the return to the home and that sort of 1950s idealization of the housewife. We have a new position and role of women, with the tension between the opportunities outside the home, new sexual mores and freedoms, and the emptiness of home, leading to a clash between old attitudes and training and the new, and a transitional period. So what we're seeing in these 1940s films potentially are these tensions arising around the idea of the home and arising around the idea of a woman's relationship to marriage, autonomy, economy, etc., and finding forms of horror within them. As Waldman notes, the Gothic mode has always allowed for these kind of articulations of feminine fear, anger, and distrust of the patriarchal order, from things like Radcliffe's novels to Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. Texts throughout the 18th and 19th centuries have allowed that space for the idea of women as under threat, pursued, captured, put away in asylums, etc. But what's interesting about these films of the war and post-war period is that they don't just concentrate on this idea of fear, anger, and distrust, but also on the affirmation of feminine perception, interpretation, and lived experience. So what do we mean by that? Well, these films offer us a sort of mystery, a puzzle. The heroine experiences a series of bizarre and uncanny incidents. The singing of Isilda, which she can't hear, but the child she's with can. The mystery of the wife's death, for example. So she experiences a series of bizarre and uncanny incidents open to ambiguous interpretation, revolving in some way around the question of whether or not the Gothic male really loves her. And what we're finding is we're presented with this mystery, a situation full of doubt. And there are two options that can occur at the untangling. One is that the female perspective, perception, and understanding of the situation is validated. The other is that it is invalidated. In the later Gothic books of the 1960s, where it's revealed that the aristocratic male isn't the baddie after all, that's an example of invalidation of the female perspective. When we find out that he was a wrong 'un from the start, and that's what she suspected, it validates the female perspective and experience. And in this war and post-war period, in these paranoid women's films, the heroine's suspicions about the Gothic male are confirmed. As we find this happening in Dragonwyck, with Miranda becoming increasingly suspicious not only of Nicholas's actions, but also of his worldview, his morals, and his politics. We find at the end of the text that she has been right all along, and her female experience is validated. But the film doesn't just make us go on this journey with her and watch her from afar. It causes us as well to go on this journey of untangling and trying to resolve the mystery. It's a test of our own perception as well. So it offers a sort of training ground for detecting areas and possibilities of danger. Now, this is a slightly provocative question and perhaps not the best phrased. But we've looked now with the idea of the Gothic romance and the paranoid women's film at how these texts, either books or films, within these traditions, can focus on questions about female experience, essentially, and questions of romance, love, and desire. Now, by asking, is there more to Dragonwyck, it is not to diminish those as subjects at all or as foci of attention. Absolutely not. But as I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk, those kind of formulaic understandings of the Gothic romance, or the denomination of a particularly female tradition of filmmaking, which is seen as sort of separate from the wider evolution of horror or mystery, etc., does tend towards narrowing down what we think these texts are doing, and their ability to do an almost innumerable amount of things. So by asking, is there more to Dragonwyck, I'm wanting to say, is it looking outside of that framing of female experience within the heterosexual marriage partnership? And my answer would be yes. The picture I've used here is an example of the political subtext of the film, which is talking about the anti-rent movement as the local tenant farmers strive to free themselves from the yoke of Nicholas as their tenant, as the landholder under whom they have their tenancies. What I want to do is take a step back, though, before thinking about the particular politics of the text, and think about the tradition in which Dragonwyck appears. So we're thinking here about the New England Gothic, one of the oldest forms of the Gothic in America, with many of the earliest works by people like Nathaniel Hawthorne being set in New England or relatively near. And I've put some examples there of famous writers, including Charlotte Perkins Gilman, more modernly Stephen King, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and of course H.P. Lovecraft with his weird Providence. Now, if we're trying to define the New England Gothic, Faye Ringel suggests that guilty secrets and unwholesome traditions are what characterize the Gothic version of New England history, which is consistently interested in elements like the Puritan past, also demonic deals and witchcraft, of course, reflecting back often on the Salem witch trials, but also on the sort of Puritan fears of the time, and also on the haunted histories of the area, both for example, the connection to the slave trade and also to the genocides that occurred against the native populations. Ringel suggests that in these texts, the Puritans stand in for the Middle Ages. And what does that mean? In the early Gothic, in the British Gothic, they're often set back in this Middle Ages period, this pre-period, this barbaric, wild period, where we are re-evaluating our relationship to the past in both positive and negative ways. In the American Gothic, this sort of barbarous past, or this traumatic, this haunted or haunting past, is this kind of Puritan past in many ways. And we'll think about how that fits in with our novel and whether it does. Another sort of frequent feature of the New England Gothic is that Gothic geography, the forests, mountains, and threatening landscapes, that being on the verge of the other, these uncontrolled spaces. And we've also got the Gothic architecture of the region, from the kind of almost faux medieval or faux Gothic buildings that were built there in this sort of sense or attempt to create a sense of kind of rooted European history there. We see it in the House of the Seven Gables, and we see it in Dragonwyck, this kind of faux Gothic mansion. Now, we mentioned there that sort of idea of the medieval and the feudal, and there is a very strong connection with Dragonwyck and this idea of sort of feudal living, as you can see from the cover of the Dragonwyck book here, and I'm not sure if you can see it very clearly, but it's a novel of America's feudal age. And the particular history that we're interacting with here is the anti-rent movement of the 1830s and 40s. So this is a real cornerstone of the film. It's in the book, but there are a number of political issues, contemporary political issues, that are addressed in the book. The film focuses in on this anti-rent movement and shows the tenant farmers revolting against this kind of aristocratic feudal system of one landowner and then tenant farmers. I want to think about particularly the Hudson Valley Gothic now and Washington Irving, because I think it's this particular variant of the Gothic with which Anya Seton is particularly in conversation. So let's go back a little bit and think about Washington Irving. If you don't know Washington Irving, he was the writer of such tales as Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow. And we find, as Barnard notes, that in writing these short stories, right at the beginning there of the 19th century, in the early days of both the Gothic and the broader sort of American literature, Irving becomes, in creating these short mythological stories, an influential ideologue of an emerging US nationalism. His fiction functions to invent traditions. It artificially constructs national popular legends and imagines a sort of cultural stability. So if we think about Rip Van Winkle, for example, well, more particularly Sleepy Hollow, he creates this sense of a settled history with its own legends and its own link to structured and stable hierarchies and traditions. He imbues in his work, Elizabeth Bradley argues, the Hudson Valley with the kind of spiritual authority that his created character Geoffrey Crayon granted to Stratford upon Avon. So the Hertford River Valley becomes the center of this kind of ideologizing of American identity. And he speaks for the Hudson River Valley tradition that is hostile to rampant capitalism and finds the latter fundamentally unnatural. Now, how does he do that? Well, he focuses on the Dutch history of the area as the sort of the true history which needs to be valued. So the Dutch settlements in the sort of New England area, we have the New Netherlands, which was from Albany, New York to Delaware in the south, parts of New York State, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Connecticut, and Delaware. The Dutch claimed the territory in 1609 after sponsoring Hendrik Hudson's voyages, and we have towns there granted self-government with attendant privileges and protections. New Amsterdam, which was obviously later New York, was the first European chartered city, and what would become the US. Towards the end of the period of Dutch control, Peter Stuyvesant was in power and the Dutch East India governor of the province of New Netherlands. But in 1664, Fort Amsterdam was relinquished to the British along with all of New Netherland. And the Dutch Empire relinquished all control in 1675. But in Sleepy Hollow, the tale of Ichabod Crane, who is a Yankee who comes into the sleepy town of Sleepy Hollow. See what I did there? Which is filled with Dutch settlers. He comes full of ambitions above his place as the local school teacher, but also he seeks to marry Katrina Van Tassel, or wants to marry Katrina Van Tassel, not just because she's a pretty girl, but also because of what she owns. And every time he sees what she owns, he imagines it not only as his, but turned into commodities. When he sees a pig, he imagines it as pork. And he imagines basically slaughtering and selling all the animals, selling the land, and then using it to move west in a further acquisitive move. What we find in Washington Irving is he separates the sort of Dutch settlements from a New England Puritan heritage, which he associates with the Yankees as a separate or differentiated group. Ichabod becomes a Yankee stereotype in the text. He's restless, desiring change. He's, as we've discussed, an emblem of capitalist acquisition. He's full of hypocrisy, and he's also associated with superstition. He's the one who loves the witchcraft tales, and he's also the one who can be manipulated through the use of superstition, because the Headless Horseman effectively runs him out of town. But is it the Headless Horseman, or is it his rival in love, Brom? And we find in the story this kind of juxtaposition of the Yankee Ichabod Crane and the Dutch tenantry, who stand for stability, tradition, security, an organic and balanced relationship to the land, and I can't see what it says at the bottom, and a clear hierarchies, clear social hierarchies. So why have I been talking about all this? What is Dragonwyck doing? How is Dragonwyck connected to all this? Well, because I think it rewrites Irving's Gothic, and it also rewrites Irving's ideas around that sort of sense of national American identity. So in Dragonwyck, we have Nicholas as the Dutch patroon, and Miranda is from Connecticut, from a family which is fairly Puritan coded, very religious family. But we have the Dutch landowner here not as a symbol of stability and tradition and a rooted history, a rooted legitimate history, which is what Irving tries to prove, but rather as archaic, exploitative, degenerate, and dangerous. Connecticut, on the other hand, or the representative thereof, takes the upper hand. Her view on life is validated. The extremism is condemned, but religion is not. And the Puritan roots are represented not as connected to capitalist acquisition, but as to work ethic and a moral core. The anti-rent movement is supported in the book and is a rejection of this Dutch landowner, but also ties into a valorization of the American dream, American individualism, and a capitalist economy. So the book produces or reinforces a new myth of America, not that new, but the popular myth of the time, of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but seen exclusively through this kind of capitalist American dream of acquisition and individualism. In the book, this is particularly stressed because after selling Dragonwyck or giving up on Dragonwyck, Miranda and Jeff move west. Now, that doesn't happen in the film, but the logics, I think, are still there. Anyway, what I hope I've shown is what a rich text this can be, especially if we approach it from a number of different dimensions. I've also hoped to show that the Gothic romance can be a number of things beyond a simple reflection of feminine wish fulfillment and desire. And also, although it does a great deal in terms of concentrating on women's experience and sort of women's experience both of patriarchy and heterosexuality, it also has the ability to do a number of other things not contained within that sort of framework. So I hope you've enjoyed. I hope it's been interesting. And this is the little bibliography if anybody was interested.